All right, guys, it's time for the return of our backyard video lessons. And we're going to start with a very common theme I've been seeing a lot of people ask me about, which is being too far across the line at the top of the backswing, which basically refers to if the shaft is pointing too much in front of my body at the top. When is it a problem? Why is it a problem? How can we go about correcting it? What are some possible solutions to it? So, we're going to look at the entirety of this situation, okay? Now, I will say it's not always problematic. In fact, there are a lot of examples you can find of some golfers who are very across the line at the top, meaning the shaft points really far in front of their body, and they can actually reroute this club into a pretty good position coming down, and it doesn't affect the way the body is moving too much through the ball. You still have the shaft that's shallowing out. There's plenty of space, obviously, to do that when you are across the line. And so certain players can get away with it. In fact, if you ever look at my golf swing, I'm on the slightly shorter side at the top and I'm a little bit across the line. Now, I would say that mine's obviously not very dramatic. Mine's just slightly in that direction, so it's less problematic. Obviously, severe extreme cases I'm not a fan of, and we're going to look at them. So, what are some of the possible reasons why a player gets across the line? Well, I'll say this. The most common one has to do, believe it or not, with the takeaway. And I've filmed videos about this before in the past, but essentially when I'm standing here, if the first move of my takeaway just whips this club really inside, I don't have a proper hinging to the club. I have a lot of early forearm rotation, or in some cases, just an excessive amount of lead wrist flexion, basically just bowing the wrist right at the start of the takeaway. I can really whip this club way inside and behind me, right? Whether through flexion, through forearm rotation, or a variety of other reasons. Now, the reason this gets a lot of players up and across is because if I never really hinge the club from here and I just keep rotating and I stop my backswing, I'm going to be super laid off. Now, the problem is this is obviously not a great big source of power, right? I'm not going to hit it very far doing that. And so what happens is most golfers know at some point they need to hinge the club up. And obviously we're trying to create more speed. So we're going to lengthen our swing out as much as we can to try to hit the ball farther. Well, if I whip this club way inside and behind my body, right, to the point where it actually disappears from my screen here, well, what's going to happen is there's going to be a domino effect. If I don't hinge the club at all, I get super laid off. I don't hit the ball very far. And the likeliness is I'm going to steepen the club big time from there and it's going to create a mess. So a lot of golfers will stand the club up really late in their backswing. Well, if my starting point is having this shaft very far behind my body early in the takeaway, and I just flick this club up in the air from that position, meaning I'm hinging the club up really late. Well, guess what direction the momentum is going to want to carry that club head when I do that, right? It's way behind me. I'm just creating some late hinging to the club, which most golfers do when they're very inside in the takeaway. I'm just going to hinge this club up in the air. Well, guess where the momentum is going to want to carry that shaft? Up and that way. And so what you end up seeing a lot of times is golfers will pull it in, whether through poor hinging mechanics, too much forearm rotation, too much lead wrist flexion, right? And from there, they stand the club up really late, and there's such an aggressive change of direction because of the momentum of that late hinging that it gets them way across the line. Now, obviously, this becomes a severe scenario where now there's way too much movement of the shaft that's required coming down to get it back into a good position. Are there outliers who can get away with it? For sure. You can find examples of outliers of any problematic scenario, essentially, in golf. But most golfers are going to struggle from there. And our job is to make life easier on golfers, not try to just add more timing and movement. And so when the shaft gets really, really far and across the line, well, now you're going to have to reroute it. If golfers don't reroute it, they'll just bring this club down super steep, and then they're going to compensate in some fashion at the bottom. No good. So that would be the most common one that we see. So in order for us to get rid of the across the line position, we have to get rid of this late hinging upwards from a very inside takeaway. And so if golfers changed the forearm movements in the takeaway and they started to get this club standing up a little bit more earlier, the club head is already going to be in a place where it's hinged up earlier. It's more vertical sooner. And that would allow us to retain some better structure going up so we can get the club more on plane. But obviously, when this club is back here, we just can't control how much it's going to hinge up when there's a lot of momentum in the swing, and it ends up a lot of times falling way across the line. That would be the first one. The second and third ones are actually quite different in the sense that they're not done through a chain reaction so much of the takeaway. The first one would be a lot of internal trail shoulder rotation. What does that basically mean? Well, if I just stand my arm out and we're going to look at my forearm's position here with the elbow joint, right, relative to my spine. The more the elbow joint works backwards and the forearm looks horizontal, right, so it looks perpendicular to my spine, the more internal shoulder rotation I'm adding here, where the elbow is working behind my body, the hand's working in front of my body. If I do the opposite and we talk about more external shoulder rotation, which actually requires a ton of mobility on the shoulder that a lot of golfers don't have, and certainly as we get older, we lose some level of mobility there. Well, as I do that, well, then I'm going to externally rotate my shoulder joint. Well, if I stand here and I just put the club in a very neutral position, the more I internally rotate my shoulder, look at how this shaft wants to go more and more across the line at the top of the backswing, right? The more I externally rotate the shoulder joint, the less across the line it's going to want to get. And so the reason for this is because as this elbow joint separates and pulls back, the hand pushes forward. Well, my hands are connected to the club. And so when the elbow pulls back and the hands push forward, I'm applying a force to the handle towards in front of me, and so towards my toes basically. And so what that's going to do is that's going to apply a certain level of pressure that's going to move the shaft more across the line. So a lot of times you'll see golfers at the top of their backswing, they might have a really good looking takeaway, they might have a good halfway back position, but then they create a lot of internal trail shoulder rotation and the shaft is across the line. That's a really easy fix in that situation if you have the mobility to do it, because then all you have to do is as you're standing this club up in the air, you just keep that trail arm a little bit more in front of the body. Don't let the elbow joint separate behind you, and you would actually get rid of that, right? Instead of being here, we keep the elbow joint more in front of us, more external shoulder rotation. Look at how the shaft completely rerouted. Now it looks like it's in a pretty good spot at the top. And obviously, if we keep that trail elbow in that same position coming down, we can keep the club nice and shallow coming down into the golf ball. Less excessive movement, again, of the shaft. So shoulder rotation plays a big factor in that as well. Now, the last one actually has to do with the wrist angles, and it has to do with the grip, because you have to consider both of them if we're looking at the club face at the same time. So if I have a wrist angle that gets too cupped on the lead hand, meaning the glove hand, right? So for me as a righty, that's my left hand. If this wrist gets way too cupped at the top, it's going to naturally want to push this shaft into an across line position. The more I try to flatten this wrist or bow it, meaning the more I try to curl the knuckles under the forearm, what you're going to see is I am going to start to reroute the shaft a little bit more laid off, which for a player who's too far across the line is a good feeling because it's working away from their problematic tendency. Now, the things you have to consider here, and this is where it gets a little more complicated, is that the grip plays a part in this. Because if I have a very, very strong grip, meaning the club is very in my fingers and obviously my hand is very on top, the lead hand here, well, I'm naturally presetting my wrist very cupped. So what's happening is it's naturally going to want to be cupped at the top. If I try to bow this wrist out with a strong grip, I might fix the shaft angle issue of where it's aligned at the top, meaning I get rid of the across position. But my club face now gets so close, when I come down, I'm going to snap hook the ball. I pretty much have no chance to avoid it. And so in this scenario, well, then weakening the grip, meaning not having it be so strong, would really help you out, because now if you have a grip that's a little bit more neutral or a little bit weaker than where it was before, a little bit closer to a weak direction, meaning not as much on top of the grip with the lead hand, a little bit more to the side. Well, now if I flatten this wrist out, well, I can still get the club avoiding being across the line, right? Very, very cupped here, very certainly working in that direction, even if it doesn't get all the way there. The more I flatten the wrist, the more I work away from being across the line. But at least now with the grip not being as strong, the club face won't be shut. So as I work on that matchup, my face angle is in a better spot to avoid hitting those snap hooks. Again, it's an extra little element you need to consider, but it's something that plays a role in all of this. And so those are the three most common scenarios. If you're going to look at your golf swing and you're somebody who's very across the line, look at those three combinations, because believe it or not, more often than not, I would argue 90-95% of the time, you'll fall into one of those three categories that's causing you to be across the line in the first place. Either you're whipping it inside for some reason or another, which we can obviously do a whole video on that as well, which creates this late hinging up and the momentum carries you very across the line. Now, as you do that, you can still see the trail shoulders obviously still internally rotated. You can see the lead wrist is still cupped, but the chain reaction of events begin with the takeaway. If your takeaway looks pretty good, but you're still getting across the line at the top, then you have to look at, is there some level of internal shoulder rotation that's causing me to get there? Is there some level of lead wrist staying cupped that's causing me to get there? More often than not, you'll fall into one of those two categories. If you're not, send me a DM. Let me take a look at it. I'd be happy to check it out and pinpoint if it's not inside one of those three categories, what the reasoning might be. Because obviously there are other cases, but we can film videos for hours on that. I just want to pinpoint the three most common for you guys, okay?